The more that I'm single, the more that I enjoy being alone.
And that right there is what feminism has done, right? Men are enjoying their peace because women no longer bring peace, they bring destruction of your peace.
Something fundamental has shifted in society, and most people sense it, even if they cannot fully articulate it yet. The rules that governed relationships, work, purpose, and identity for decades are breaking down in real time, and the consequences are no longer theoretical. What happens when one side of society walks away completely, not in anger, not in protest, but in quiet finality? Stay with me until the end, because once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. If you find value in content like this, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every Angry Guy video the moment we release it. It helps the channel grow and ensures these conversations continue to happen. Also, check out Angry's Crypto Academy, linked in the description. If you want to learn how to protect your assets, safeguard your wealth, and understand how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly in an unstable world, that is exactly what the Academy is built for. And if you are enjoying these videos and want to support the channel directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. Every bit of support helps keep this content independent. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening. For the last several decades, society has told men a very specific story about who they are and what their role should be. That story has been repeated so often through media, education, policy, and culture that it became normalized. Men were told their instincts were wrong, their ambitions were suspect, their strength was dangerous, and their presence was optional. They were told that traditional masculine traits were outdated or harmful, that restraint and compliance were virtues, and that stepping back was the morally correct choice. And eventually, many men listened. What followed was not a loud rebellion. It was not marches or protests or demands. It was something far more disruptive. Men began withdrawing quietly. They stopped participating in systems that punished them. They reduced their exposure to risk. They worked less in environments that offered no loyalty. They stopped chasing approval. They invested in their health privately, built skills independently, created online income streams, explored decentralized finance, and learned to live with fewer obligations and fewer dependencies. They chose peace. At first, this withdrawal went largely unnoticed. Society assumed men would always be there to fill the gaps, to absorb pressure, to stabilize systems under stress. But as economic conditions tightened and living costs exploded, the absence became impossible to ignore. Housing became unaffordable. Food prices surged. Debt increased. Social safety nets thinned. And suddenly, the assumption that someone else would always step in no longer held. What many people are witnessing now is not just economic stress, but social recalibration. Entire industries that relied on male participation began faltering. Dating culture slowed. Hospitality venues struggled. Discretionary spending declined. The informal support structures that once existed between individuals dissolved. And with that dissolution came panic, confusion, and blame. A critical mistake many commentators make is treating this as a sudden event rather than the delayed consequence of long term messaging. When a group is told repeatedly that they are unnecessary, eventually they believe it. When they are told to leave others alone, eventually they do. When they are told that silence is safer than engagement, eventually silence becomes the norm. And silence, once established, is difficult to reverse. There's also a deeper psychological shift taking place. Men are rediscovering something that modern life slowly stripped away: the understanding that solitude is not the same as isolation. Being alone does not automatically mean being lonely. Many men learned that when external demands fell away, internal clarity increased, sleep improved, stress decreased, focus sharpened, expenses dropped, life simplified. And with simplicity came a sense of control that had been missing for years. Meanwhile, a parallel crisis emerged elsewhere. Many people who were encouraged to build their identity entirely around institutions, credentials, and external validation found those structures unstable. Jobs became precarious, debt became permanent, promises of security dissolved, and without strong interpersonal bonds to fall back on, the pressure became overwhelming. This is why social media is now filled with anxiety, confusion, and frustration. It is not about romance alone, it is about survival. One of the most uncomfortable truths in any cultural shift is that systems do not care about individuals. Governments care about compliance. Corporations care about productivity. Platforms care about engagement. When individuals mistake institutional incentives for genuine support, they are left vulnerable when conditions change. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Groups are empowered rhetorically, encouraged behaviorally, and abandoned structurally. The idea that freedom automatically produces fulfillment is one of the great misunderstandings of modern culture. Freedom without stability becomes chaos. Choice without accountability becomes paralysis. Independence without preparation becomes dependence on something larger and less forgiving. These realities do not discriminate, they apply to everyone. Another factor often ignored in mainstream discussion is time horizon. Short term emotional satisfaction often conflicts with long term outcomes. Decisions that feel empowering in the moment can quietly close doors years later. Biology, economics, and social dynamics all operate on timelines that do not care about narratives. When those timelines converge, the results feel sudden, even though they were years in the making. This is where many conversations break down because acknowledging long term consequences is uncomfortable. It requires admitting that some advice was incomplete, some slogans were misleading, and some promises were conditional. It also requires recognizing that human nature does not bend easily to ideology. Men and women are different in meaningful ways, not better or worse, but different in needs, risk tolerance, communication styles, and long term priorities. Ignoring those differences does not eliminate them, it simply postpones the reckoning. Men historically acted as buffers between individuals and harsh systems. They absorbed risk, negotiated danger, and mitigated instability. When that buffering role disappears, systems feel sharper, colder, and more punitive. Bureaucracies replace relationships, rules replace discretion, surveillance replaces trust. And once that transition is complete, reversing it is extraordinarily difficult. You can see this emerging clearly in how regulation, digital identity systems, and centralized controls are expanding under the banner of safety and efficiency. These systems promise protection, but they extract autonomy. They promise convenience, but they demand compliance. And once people become dependent on them, opting out is no longer a realistic option. What many men have done instinctively is step outside these structures before they fully close. They are building parallel lives that require less permission, fewer credentials, less oversight, more adaptability. This is not rebellion, it is risk management, it is pattern recognition applied to lived experience. The tragedy is that many people were never taught to think this way. They were taught to trust systems, follow instructions, and assume continuity. When continuity breaks, they feel betrayed rather than unprepared. And preparation, not blame, is what determines outcomes during periods of transition. As this shift accelerates, misunderstandings increase. Withdrawal is interpreted as hostility, silence is interpreted as punishment, absence is interpreted as abandonment. But from the perspective of those who stepped away, it is simply boundary enforcement. They are no longer willing to subsidize systems that offer no reciprocity. They are no longer willing to absorb risk without agency. They are no longer willing to trade peace for approval. None of this means society cannot adapt. It means adaptation requires honesty. It requires acknowledging incentives, consequences, and biological realities without moralizing them. It requires rebuilding trust at the interpersonal level rather than outsourcing it entirely to institutions. And it requires recognizing that once people learn how to live without something, convincing them to return requires more than nostalgia or guilt. This is the crossroads we are at now. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. One path leads toward greater centralization, increased dependency, and reduced personal autonomy. The other leads toward decentralization, personal responsibility, and selective engagement. People will choose differently based on their experiences, their risk tolerance, and their understanding of the future. The men who walked away did not do so because they hated society. They did so because society stopped making sense to them. They optimize for survival, stability, and peace. And once those needs are met, it is very difficult to convince someone to re-enter a system that previously punished them for participation. As economic pressure continues to rise, these dynamics will become more visible, not less. The illusion of endless support will fade. The cost of dependence will increase, and the value of self-sufficiency will become undeniable. To understand why this shift feels so jarring, you have to understand how deeply people were conditioned to believe that the old arrangement would last forever. For generations, there was an unspoken contract in society. Men provided stability, labor, protection, and infrastructure. In return, they were offered belonging, purpose, and respect. That contract was never perfect, but it functioned well enough to keep civilization moving forward. What changed was not just the economy or technology, but the story told about that contract. Over time, the narrative shifted from cooperation to critique. Masculinity was no longer framed as a stabilizing force, but as something to be managed, corrected, or restrained. Men were encouraged to step aside so systems could replace them. The assumption was that institutions could replicate what human bonds once handled naturally. But institutions do not love, sacrifice, or adapt instinctively. They follow incentives, not conscience. As this messaging intensified, something subtle but important happened. Men began internalizing the idea that participation was optional, but responsibility was still mandatory. They were still expected to produce, to contribute, to comply, but without the corresponding sense of ownership or appreciation. That imbalance is unsustainable. When effort is consistently decoupled from reward, people eventually disengage. This disengagement did not happen overnight, it happened in phases. First came emotional withdrawal. Men stopped sharing their concerns because they were dismissed. Then came social withdrawal. They reduced unnecessary interactions to avoid risk. Then came economic withdrawal. They minimized expenses, downsized lifestyles, and questioned the value of traditional career paths. Finally came cultural withdrawal. They stopped caring about narratives that no longer aligned with observable reality. What replaced this was not nihilism, as many assume, but pragmatism. Men began asking different questions. What do I actually need to live well? How much income is enough? What environments reward effort rather than punish it? Where can I invest my energy without constant friction? These questions led to answers that looked very different from the previous generation's blueprint. Remote work, online businesses, decentralized finance, skill-based income, and minimalist living all fit neatly into this new framework. These are not trends driven by laziness or escapism. They are adaptations to an environment that no longer rewards traditional sacrifice. When the future feels uncertain, flexibility becomes more valuable than status. At the same time, Many people who were encouraged to build their identity around visibility and validation found themselves increasingly anxious. Social approval is volatile. Algorithms change. Attention fades. And when external affirmation dries up, there is often very little underneath to sustain confidence. This is why so many conversations online now revolve around burnout, regret, and confusion. People followed the map they were given, only to discover it led to a dead end. Another overlooked aspect of the shift is how differently men and women experience risk. Men, historically, were socialized to accept delayed gratification and long term hardship in exchange for future stability. Worried? Women were often encouraged to prioritize immediate safety and emotional well being. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but when one becomes dominant at the societal level, long term resilience suffers. Safety focused systems tend to trade freedom for predictability. They reduce variance, but also reduce opportunity. Over time, these systems become rigid. Innovation slows, costs rise, and when stress hits, there is little slack left to absorb it. This is exactly what we are seeing now. A world optimized for comfort struggles under pressure. Men stepping away removed a critical stabilizing force from this equation. Not because men are inherently superior, but because they historically absorbed discomfort that systems now cannot. When men stopped doing that quietly, the cracks became visible. Prices rose, services declined, accountability vanished, and frustration turned inward. Many people responded to this by doubling down on rhetoric rather than adjusting strategy. They blamed individuals rather than incentives. They demanded compliance rather than cooperation. They moralized outcomes rather than examining causes. This approach may feel satisfying in the short term, but it accelerates disengagement in the long term. One of the hardest realities for any society to accept is that you cannot shame people into caring. You cannot guilt them into sacrificing. You cannot threaten them into building something they no longer believe in. Participation must feel voluntary, meaningful, and reciprocal. Once those elements disappear, people will find alternatives. This is where parallel economies emerge, informal networks, skill exchanges, private communities, decentralized platforms. These systems operate quietly, often beneath the surface of mainstream visibility. They are resilient precisely because they are not centralized. They do not require universal buy in. They grow through trust, not mandates. People who rely entirely on centralized systems often underestimate how quickly these alternatives can scale. They assume legitimacy flows only from authority. In reality, legitimacy flows from usefulness. If a system solves problems reliably, people will use it regardless of whether it is officially sanctioned. As centralized systems become more complex and restrictive, the incentive to exit increases. Compliance costs rise, friction multiplies, surveillance expands. Meanwhile, parallel systems offer simplicity, discretion, and autonomy. The choice becomes obvious for those paying attention. Another layer to this transformation is demographic reality. Aging populations, declining birth rates, and workforce contraction all compound the problem. Fewer producers supporting more dependents is mathematically unsustainable. No amount of narrative framing can change that. When productivity declines and consumption remains high, debt fills the gap until it no longer can. This is why many governments now rely on financial engineering rather than genuine growth. Debt expansion, currency debasement, and regulatory control temporarily mask structural weakness. But these tools lose effectiveness over time. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the illusion exceeds the benefit. Men, sensing this intuitively, adjusted their behavior accordingly. They reduced exposure to debt. They avoided long term liabilities. They prioritized liquidity and mobility. These are not ideological choices. They are survival strategies in an unstable environment. Contrast this with the messaging many people received growing up. They were told to specialize early, commit deeply, and trust the system to reward them. That advice made sense in a stable world. It is dangerous in a volatile one. When conditions change faster than institutions can adapt, rigid commitments become traps. This divergence in strategy is now creating visible tension. Those who exited early appear calm. Those still invested in failing structures feel betrayed. The resentment that follows is often misdirected. It targets individuals rather than incentives. It demands restoration rather than reinvention, but restoration is unlikely. Once people experience life with lower stress, fewer obligations, and greater autonomy, they rarely volunteer to return to high pressure environments, especially when the promised rewards are uncertain or conditional. Another important point often missed is that walking away does not mean opting out of responsibility entirely. It means choosing which responsibilities are worth carrying. Men did not abandon work, they abandoned unreciprocated work. They did not reject relationships, they rejected asymmetrical ones. They did not reject society, they rejected narratives that no longer aligned with reality. This distinction matters because it reframes the conversation from blame to alignment. People are not disappearing, they are relocating their effort, they are investing where returns exist. That is how rational actors behave. As this continues, the gap between expectation and reality will widen for those who remain dependent on external validation and institutional support. Promises will be revised, benefits will be reduced, access will be conditional, and those conditions will change frequently. The uncomfortable truth is that no system can replace genuine human cooperation. Laws cannot manufacture trust. Policies cannot substitute for accountability. And slogans cannot override biology or economics. When systems attempt to do so, they eventually collapse under their own weight. This brings us back to the present moment. The reason so many people feel disoriented is because the old map no longer works. The landmarks are gone. The shortcuts lead nowhere. And the authorities who insisted they knew the way are quietly adjusting their language. Men who stepped away early did not do so because they were bitter. They did so because they were paying attention. They noticed patterns. They adjusted accordingly. And now, as conditions worsen, their choices look less radical and more prescient. The question going forward is not whether society will change. It already is. The question is who will adapt willingly and who will resist until adaptation is forced upon them. History suggests the latter group suffers more. To understand where this ultimately leads, you have to stop thinking in terms of blame and start thinking in terms of incentives. People do not behave based on what they are told they should want. They behave based on what is rewarded, what is punished, and what is tolerated. When incentives change, behavior follows regardless of ideology, emotion, or intention. For decades, men were incentivized to sacrifice first and ask questions later. Work harder, commit longer, take on more risk, provide stability even when systems were unstable. In return, there was once a clear payoff: family, legacy, respect, continuity. As those rewards became conditional, delayed indefinitely, or quietly removed, the incentive structure collapsed. No amount of moral pressure can override that reality. At the same time, many people were incentivized to externalize responsibility. When problems arose, the solution was framed as more protection, more intervention, more oversight. This approach feels comforting in the short term because it shifts accountability upward. But over time, it erodes competence. When individuals are shielded from consequences repeatedly, they stop developing the skills needed to navigate adversity. This is not a judgment, it is a pattern observed throughout history. Civilizations that prioritize comfort over competence eventually struggle when conditions tighten. Skills ask to atrophy, dependency grows, and when the system that provides comfort falters, there is very little resilience left. Men walking away accelerated this process because it removed a key stabilizing force, quietly holding things together. Men absorbed inefficiencies, they filled gaps, they tolerated friction. When they stopped doing that, systems were exposed for what they actually were: brittle, expensive, and slow to adapt. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the assumption that men left because they were rejected. In reality, many left because they were accepted into a role they did not consent to. A role defined by constant scrutiny, limited upside, and disproportionate risk. Over time, opting out became the rational choice. As this opt out behavior spread, it created a feedback loop. Fewer participants meant higher costs for those remaining. Higher costs increased stress. Stress amplified demands. Demands increased resistance. Resistance led to further withdrawal. This cycle is now visible across multiple domains, from labor markets to social life to community engagement. The labor market is a clear example. Many employers assumed loyalty was guaranteed. They replaced experience with compliance. They prioritized optics over output. When economic pressure arrived, layoffs followed quickly. Those who watched this unfold learned a lesson. Institutions do not reciprocate loyalty, they optimize for survival, not fairness. As a result, men began optimizing for optionality. They diversified income. They avoided debt. They invested in portable skills. They questioned the wisdom of tying their future to organizations that could discard them overnight. Again, this is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. Relationships followed a similar trajectory. When commitment became associated with asymmetric risk and unclear reward, caution replaced enthusiasm. Men did not stop valuing connection. They stopped assuming connection would be mutual. Trust, once broken repeatedly, does not regenerate easily. This shift has profound implications for how society functions. Informal support networks weaken, community ties fray. Transactional interactions replace relational ones. People begin pricing risk into every exchange. What once flowed freely now requires negotiation. The irony is that many of the policies designed to increase safety ended up increasing distance. Rules intended to prevent harm discouraged interaction. Systems designed to protect feelings discouraged honesty. Over time, avoidance became safer than engagement. And when avoidance becomes the default, loneliness increases even as connectivity expands. Another layer to this transformation is the changing nature of work itself. Automation, artificial intelligence, and platformization have reduced the need for certain roles while increasing competition for others. This creates a bifurcated landscape where a small number of people thrive while many struggle to find stable footing. Men who anticipated this shift early adjusted accordingly. They avoided career paths with shrinking demand. They learned skills that scale. They accepted volatility in exchange for autonomy. Those who did not adapt found themselves trapped in systems that no longer functioned as promised. This divergence is often framed as inequality, but it is more accurately described as adaptability. Those who read signals and adjust behavior survive transitions more smoothly. Those who cling to outdated expectations experience sharper shocks. Emotional narratives struggle in this environment because reality does not negotiate. Bills arrive on time. Markets respond to supply and demand. Biology operates on its own timeline. Ignoring these forces does not neutralize them, it only delays confrontation. One of the most difficult realizations for many people is that fairness is not a natural law. It is a human construct that requires maintenance. When the mechanisms that enforce fairness weaken Outcomes revert to underlying dynamics. Strength, competence, and adaptability regain importance. Men stepping away did not create these dynamics. They simply stopped compensating for them. And without compensation, reality reasserted itself quickly. This reassertion is now being interpreted as cruelty by those unprepared for it. But from another perspective, it is neutrality. The absence of cushioning reveals how dependent many systems had become on invisible labor and unacknowledged sacrifice. The psychological impact of this revelation is significant. People who believed they were secure discover they were merely buffered. People who believed they were independent discover they were supported indirectly. And when those supports vanish, confusion turns into anger, and anger seeks a target. It looks for a villain. But complex systems rarely collapse because of a single cause. They collapse because multiple assumptions fail simultaneously. When energy is spent assigning blame rather than rebuilding competence, recovery slows. This is why some men now appear indifferent to the frustration around them. They are not unaffected by suffering. They simply understand that participation without agency leads nowhere. They learned that rescuing systems that refuse reform is futile. Another uncomfortable truth is that not everyone will adapt successfully. Transitions produce winners and losers. That reality is not pleasant, but it is consistent. Pretending otherwise only increases long-term damage. Those who thrive in the coming years will be those who combine realism with restraint. They will avoid extremes. They will question narratives. They will invest in health, skills, and relationships that demonstrate reciprocity. They will minimize dependency on any single system, and those who struggle will often be those who wait for external rescue, who expect restoration rather than reinvention, who cling to identities built around vanished incentives. This is not destiny, it is probability. And probability shifts based on behavior. Men who walked away early increased their probability of stability. They did not do so because they wanted collapse. They did so because they saw it coming. They prepared quietly. They adjusted expectations. They accepted trade offs. What is unfolding now is not a gender conflict, it is a competence gap between those who adapted and those who did not, between those who prioritized long term resilience and those who prioritize short term comfort. As conditions continue to tighten, this gap will widen. Systems will demand more while offering less. Institutions will rebrand failures as transitions. Responsibility will be reframed as solidarity. But none of that changes the underlying math. At the individual level, the choice remains the same: learn, adapt, simplify, or resist, deny, and hope someone else intervenes. Men walking away did not end society. They simply stopped carrying it alone. At some point, belief gives way to observation. That moment is different for everyone, but once it happens, it cannot be undone. Belief is sustained by trust, and trust is sustained by consistency. When words and outcomes stop matching, belief erodes quietly at first, then suddenly all at once. This is the point many men reached long before the broader culture realized anything was wrong. For years, men were told that if they followed the rules, things would work out. Be respectful, be patient, be supportive, invest in education, commit to careers, trust institutions, trust narratives, trust promises. But lived experience began contradicting these assurances. Effort no longer correlated with reward. Compliance did not produce stability. Sacrifice did not lead to security. And when people raised concerns, they were often dismissed or told they simply were not trying hard enough. That dismissal was pivotal. When people feel unheard repeatedly, they stop speaking. When they stop speaking, they start watching. Observation replaces participation. Pattern recognition replaces belief. And patterns, once identified, guide behavior far more effectively than ideology ever could. One of the clearest patterns men noticed was that accountability had become selective. Rules existed, but enforcement was uneven. Responsibility was discussed, but rarely assigned downward. Consequences were framed as oppression rather than feedback. Over time, this created an environment where incentives favored avoidance over contribution. The rational response to such an environment is disengagement. Disengagement is often mischaracterized as apathy, but it is actually a form of boundary setting. It is the decision to no longer invest energy where it is consistently devalued. This applies not just to relationships, but to work, community involvement, and public life. When the cost of participation exceeds the benefit, participation declines. Communication breakdown accelerated this process. Honest dialogue became risky. Nuance was replaced by slogans. Disagreement was interpreted as hostility. As a result, many men learned that silence was safer than speech, not because they lacked opinions, but because expressing them carried disproportionate consequences. Silence, however, does not mean absence of thought. It means thought is directed inward and outward selectively. Men began discussing these issues privately, in small groups, online forums, and informal networks. These conversations were pragmatic rather than ideological. They focused on what worked, what did not, and how to adapt. This quiet exchange of information created a distributed knowledge base. Best practices spread quickly. Mistakes were analyzed openly. Lessons were learned without the need for approval. Over time, this decentralized learning outpaced institutional guidance, which was often slow, contradictory, or detached from reality. Another pattern that became impossible to ignore was the mismatch between rhetoric and results. Policies designed to promote well being often produced the opposite effect. Initiatives intended to reduce stress increased it. Systems built to provide security created dependency. And narratives meant to empower left many people feeling less capable, not more. Men recognize that systems optimize for perception rather than performance inevitably fail under pressure. Appearances can be managed, reality cannot. When reality intrudes, systems either adapt or collapse. Many did neither. They doubled down on messaging instead. At this point, trust broke completely for many observers. Trust, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. It requires not just apology, but sustained behavioral change. That change was rarely forthcoming. Instead, institutions demanded renewed faith without offering evidence. This further accelerated withdrawal. What replaced trust was conditional engagement. Men began interacting with systems only when necessary on their own terms and with clear exit strategies. They minimized exposure. They documented interactions. They reduced reliance. This is not paranoia, it is adaptation. In an environment perceived as unpredictable, this shift had cascading effects. Social cohesion weakened. Informal mentorship declined. Community involvement dropped. These losses are often blamed on technology or individualism, but the root cause is misaligned incentives. When helping others carries risk without reward, people stop doing it. The long term consequence of this is a colder society, not because people are inherently unkind, but because kindness without protection becomes liability. When generosity is punished or exploited, caution replaces openness. Over time, this transforms culture itself. Men also observed how quickly narratives shifted when conditions changed. Ideas once presented as absolute were quietly revised. Promises were reframed. Expectations were lowered. This reinforced the lesson that narratives serve power structures, not individuals. Once that realization sets in, belief gives way permanently to skepticism. Skepticism is not cynicism, it is the demand for evidence. Men began evaluating claims based on outcomes rather than intentions. They asked simple questions. Does this policy improve life measurably? Does this relationship offer mutual benefit? Does this commitment increase stability or reduce it? If the answer was unclear or negative, they opted out. This evaluative mindset extended to identity itself. Men stopped defining themselves by roles assigned externally: provider, ally, participant. Instead, they define themselves by internal metrics: health, peace, autonomy, competence. These metrics are harder to manipulate because they are personally verifiable. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this transition is that it does not require resentment. Many men walked away calmly. They did not need validation. They simply recalibrated priorities. Once peace becomes the primary goal, many external pressures lose their power. Meanwhile, those still invested in legacy systems experienced increasing stress. As participation declined, demands increased. As demands increased, resistance grew. This created a spiral of tension that no amount of messaging could resolve. Systems cannot coerce genuine engagement indefinitely without degrading further. Another critical pattern men noticed was the fragility of consensus. Social agreement depends on shared incentives. When incentives diverge, consensus dissolves. Attempts to enforce consensus through pressure backfire, accelerating fragmentation. And fragmentation is often framed as chaos, but it can also be a precursor to reorganization. Old structures must fail before new ones can form. The danger lies in trying to preserve dysfunctional systems at all costs. That prolongs suffering without preventing collapse. Men who exited early positioned themselves advantageously for this reorganization. They reduced dependency. They increased adaptability. They built redundancy into their lives. These are classic survival strategies, not political statements. As trust in centralized authority declined, trust in peer networks increased. People began relying on reputation rather than credentials, skill rather than status, reliability rather than branding. This shift is subtle but profound. It redistributes power horizontally rather than vertically. However, not everyone benefits equally from this redistribution. Those comfortable navigating uncertainty thrive. Those who require structure struggle. This is why the transition feels unfair to many. It is not evenly distributed. The challenge going forward is that rebuilding trust requires more than reforms. It requires reestablishing reciprocity. People must believe that participation will be met with fairness, that effort will be acknowledged, and that boundaries will be respected. Without these conditions, withdrawal remains rational. Men who walked away did not do so because they disliked responsibility. They did so because responsibility without agency is exploitation. Once that distinction is understood, it becomes impossible to ignore. This brings us to the present crossroads. One path attempts to restore belief through persuasion, pressure, and policy. The other accepts reality and adapts accordingly. History suggests the latter path produces more durable outcomes, even if it is uncomfortable initially. When trust collapses at scale, people do not simply drift aimlessly, they reorganize. They seek structures that feel predictable, fair, and controllable. This is how parallel systems form, not as a coordinated movement, not as a manifesto, but as a natural response to instability. When official channels become unreliable, unofficial ones fill the gap. Parallel systems are often misunderstood because they operate quietly. They do not advertise. They do not ask permission. They are built through repeated interaction and mutual verification. Someone proves useful. Someone proves reliable. Someone proves discreet. Trust accumulates slowly, then solidifies. Over time, these networks become more resilient than centralized alternatives precisely because they are harder to regulate, capture, or collapse all at once. Men gravitated toward these systems instinctively, not out of malice or exclusion, but out of necessity. Centralized systems had become high friction, high risk, and low reward. Parallel systems offered the opposite: lower visibility, higher trust, clear reciprocity. These conditions are not ideological, they are functional. This is why decentralization accelerates during periods of institutional failure. People do not abandon systems because they are rebellious. They abandon them because the systems no longer serve their interests. When participation becomes punitive, exit becomes rational. One of the most important things to understand about parallel systems is that they do not require universal inclusion to function. They only require enough competent participants to sustain exchange. This makes them robust. They do not collapse under disagreement, they simply route around it. As these systems grow, those outside them often feel increasingly disconnected. Opportunities seem to vanish, access feels restricted, outcomes appear unfair. But from the inside, the logic is simple: trust is earned, contribution matters, risk is managed collectively. This shift fundamentally changes how value is assessed. Credentials lose importance, titles matter less. What matters is whether someone delivers consistently without creating problems. Reliability becomes currency. Silence becomes a signal of discretion rather than disengagement. Men who adapted early learned to operate comfortably in this environment. They did not need public validation. They did not require institutional approval. They built lives that functioned independently of mainstream narratives. As a result, they were less affected by volatility. Those who remained fully dependent on centralized systems experienced the opposite. As systems tightened control, flexibility decreased. As compliance requirements increased, autonomy shrank. When pressure mounted, there were few alternatives available. This divergence is now producing visible cultural tension. People embedded in parallel systems appear calm, detached, and indifferent. Those outside feel anxious, abandoned, and resentful. This emotional contrast is often misinterpreted as cruelty, when it is actually asymmetry of exposure. Another crucial factor is that parallel systems reward long term thinking. Short term emotional reactions are costly, reputation matters. Burn bridges and access disappears. This naturally filters out impulsive behavior. Over time, norms stabilize without formal enforcement. Centralized systems, by contrast, often incentivize short term signaling. Visibility is rewarded, outrage spreads, accountability diffuses. This creates noise rather than clarity. In high stress environments, noise becomes dangerous. Men recognized this difference and adjusted accordingly. They minimized participation in noisy spaces. They reduced public exposure. They focused on environments where actions mattered more than appearances. This reduced stress dramatically. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. Living in a system where effort reliably produces results restores a sense of agency. Agency reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety improves decision making. This creates a positive feedback loop that compounds over time. Meanwhile, environments that constantly change rules, reinterpret outcomes, and moralize failure erode agency. People become cautious, then defensive, then disengaged. Creativity declines, initiative disappears, compliance replaces contribution. This is why attempts to force participation rarely succeed long term. You can mandate presence, but you cannot mandate investment. People show up physically while checking out mentally. Systems hollow out from the inside. As parallel systems mature, they begin to outcompete centralized ones quietly, not by scale, but by efficiency. They solve problems faster. They allocate resources more effectively. They adapt quicker. Eventually, they become the default for those who know how to access them. Access, however, is not evenly distributed. It requires skills many people were never encouraged to develop: negotiation, boundary setting, technical competence, emotional restraint, long term planning. These skills were deprioritized in favor of compliance and credentialism. Men who cultivated these skills found themselves increasingly self sufficient. They required fewer external services. They relied less on formal institutions. This reduced their exposure to systemic shocks. At the same time, many people were encouraged to outsource these skills, to rely on systems for conflict resolution, for risk management, for decision making. When those systems faltered, there was little internal capacity to compensate. This gap explains much of the current distress. It is not that opportunities disappeared, it is that the ability to seize them was unevenly distributed. Preparation matters more than rhetoric in periods of transition. Another aspect of this transformation is how it affects relationships. Relationships, like systems, function on reciprocity. When expectations become asymmetrical, trust erodes. Men learned to recognize patterns that signaled imbalance early and disengage quickly. This does not mean avoiding connection entirely, it means being selective. Quality over quantity, mutual benefit over obligation. This selectivity protects peace and preserves energy. People unfamiliar with this mindset often misinterpret it as coldness. In reality, it is efficiency. Emotional labor is finite, attention is valuable. Once people understand this, they allocate both carefully. This selective engagement extends to community as well. Men participate where contribution is recognized and boundaries are respected. They withdraw where expectations are vague and costs are high. As this behavior becomes more common, communities change shape: smaller, tighter, less performative, more functional. These communities may be invisible to outsiders, but they are resilient. The broader society, however, struggles to adapt. Centralized narratives lag behind lived reality. Policies are reactive rather than proactive. Messaging assumes compliance that no longer exists. This creates a widening disconnect between expectation and outcome. Attempts to close this gap through pressure often accelerate fragmentation. People do not respond well to coercion when alternatives exist. They simply move further out of reach. The uncomfortable truth is that not everyone will be included in the next iteration of social organization. Inclusion requires contribution. Contribution requires competence. Competence requires effort and accountability. These are not optional. Men who accepted this reality early positioned themselves advantageously. They did not wait for permission. They did not ask for validation. They built quietly, and those who waited for reassurance are now discovering that reassurance does not produce results. Only action does. Every major transition in history follows the same pattern. First, the warning signs appear. Then they are ignored. Then they are mocked. Then they are explained away. And finally, when the consequences arrive, people ask how it happened so suddenly. What they really mean is how it happened without permission. And what we are living through now is not a sudden collapse. It is the delayed result of decades of decisions, incentives, and messaging converging all at once. Systems that relied on invisible labor are discovering that labor is no longer invisible nor guaranteed. Social contracts that depended on unspoken compliance are dissolving because compliance was never sustainable without reciprocity. Men did not vanish, they recalibrated. They did what humans have always done when environments become hostile or unrewarding. They adapted, they simplified, they conserved energy, they chose peace over performance. They stopped explaining themselves to people who never intended to listen. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only works when the target values the approval of the person applying it. Once approval loses value, Shame loses power. Many men cross that threshold quietly. They no longer needed validation from institutions, media, or social narratives that consistently misrepresented their lived reality. The most difficult truth for many people to accept is that you cannot force someone to care. Care emerges when effort is met with fairness, when risk is shared, when contribution is acknowledged. Remove those conditions, and care evaporates regardless of how loudly it is demanded. This is also why so many appeals now sound hollow. They ask for sacrifice without offering stability. They ask for trust without accountability. They ask for participation without agency. And people who have learned through experience that these offers are empty simply decline. What replaces belief after it collapses is not hatred, it is clarity. Clarity about limits, clarity about priorities, clarity about what is worth investing in and what is not. Once clarity arrives, behavior changes permanently. The future will not look like the past, and that is unsettling for those who built their identity around old guarantees. Degrees no longer guarantee security. Jobs no longer guarantee stability. Relationships no longer guarantee mutual effort. Institutions no longer guarantee protection. These losses feel personal, but they are structural. Those who thrive going forward will be those who internalize this reality without resentment. They will build lives that function without constant external support. They will prioritize health, competence, adaptability, and discretion. They will choose fewer commitments, but honor them fully. Those who struggle will often be those who continue waiting for systems to return to a state that no longer exists. They will interpret adaptation as abandonment, independence as cruelty, boundaries as hostility. But reality does not negotiate based on feelings. It responds to action. One of the greatest mistakes societies make during transitions is confusing criticism with care. Men who walked away were often labeled uncaring. In truth, many cared deeply until caring became a liability. When concern is punished and silence is safer, silence wins. The idea that people owe participation simply by virtue of existence is a dangerous one. Participation must be earned by systems, just as trust must be earned by individuals. Once that understanding disappears, systems begin consuming their own base. This is why the conversation going forward must shift away from blame and toward alignment. Not who is at fault, but what incentives exist. Not who is wrong, but what works. Not who should sacrifice, but why they would choose to. The world ahead will reward those who think clearly under pressure, who resist emotional manipulation, who verify claims through outcomes, who understand that freedom without responsibility is chaos, but responsibility without freedom is captivity. Men walking away was not the end of society, it was a signal that the old balance was broken, a signal that adaptation was overdue, a signal that peace, once found, is not easily surrendered. What happens next depends on whether society chooses introspection or denial, whether it rebuilds trust through reciprocity or attempts to enforce compliance through pressure, whether it values competence or clings to comforting narratives. History suggests that transitions are painful but clarifying. They strip away illusions, they expose incentives, they force choices, and they reward those who prepared quietly rather than those who demanded loudly. This is not about triumph, it is about consequence, not about victory, about reality asserting itself after years of being deferred. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is simple. Systems that rely on sacrifice must honor it. Relationships that demand effort must reciprocate it. And narratives that promise outcomes must deliver them. When those conditions fail, people will walk away, not in anger, not in protest, but in calm acceptance that their energy is better spent elsewhere. And once they do, they rarely return. At this point, the path forward is clear for those willing to see it. Build competence, reduce dependency, choose peace, Invest where effort is respected. Withdraw where it is exploited. The world will continue changing, whether anyone is ready or not. The only real choice left is how to respond. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about everything we discussed? Do you agree? Do you see these patterns around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because conversations like this matter. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MNWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.